chess friends, how are you today? I am very excited to showcase an impressive and beautiful chess game played between Obsidian and Akimbo. Both are super chess engines, and this game is completely astonishing. In the middle game, Obsidian sacrificed its rook completely to expose the black king. This is incredible. So let's dive right into it. Super chess engine Obsidian started the game with e4, and black responded with e5. After a few moves, we reached the Ruy Lopez, and black played bishop to c5, which is the classical variation of this opening. In this line, when I played bishop to b5, black could potentially go for the knight f6, Berlin defense. This is a possibility in the game, where white typically responds with d3 or knight to c3. However, knight c3 could prompt black's idea of playing knight to d4, which is a viable option. If black were to capture the e5 pawn, it would complicate things with the queen to e7 move, but it's a valid and dramatic option. In our actual game, though, black chose the classical variation of the Ruy Lopez. White chose to go with c3, known as the Alpine defense. This c3 move can be tricky in some variations, as black may opt to play pawn to d4 and strike in the center immediately. This action opens up the light squares in the center for the bishop, allowing it to enter the c2 square and create a queen-bishop battery, disrupting black's kingside. Additionally, white's knight can swiftly move to the g5 square with support from the bishop and push the h-pawn to launch a kingside attack, which is a viable strategy. Another approach with c3 is to play d4, maneuver the knight to d2 f1, and g3 squares, positioning it on the f5 outpost, creating vulnerability for the black king. After black moved back their bishop, they could play knight to f6, it was a valid option. However, at this point, black chooses to play bishop to b6, white strikes in the center with d4, creating a vulnerable situation around the center. Playing knight to f6 was an option to attack the pawn immediately. Therefore, I can play a4. At this point, some may consider capturing the e4 pawn since it appears to be unprotected. However, after I capture your knight on the c6 square, I can immediately threaten your bishop by advancing my a5 pawn, trapping your bishop. In our actual game, after he took the d4 pawn, we had pawn exchanges, and you can see that I gained two central pawns to control these diagonals. Playing knight to f6 was still an option to consider. There's no need to worry about the f7 pawn being attacked by my bishop on c4, especially with the knight on the g5 square. Black could easily castle at this point, but instead, they decided to move their knight back to e7. This move seems passive, but it consists the strategy to push the c6 and d5 pawns in the center to gain dominance and activate the bishop along this diagonal. White responded by advancing their pawn to the d5 square. This d5 pawn not only strengthens control over the center but also blocks the light square bishop while opening up the diagonal for the dark square bishop. After black played knight to f6 to target these pawns, I moved my knight to c3. A few moves later, black castled to activate their light square bishop by pushing their d6 pawn, a move that passivates their queenside and central pieces. Then Obsidian came with the brilliant tactical move of pushing the pawn to d6, attacking the knight and strategically restricting black's pieces. This move also sets up the opportunity to drop the bishop to b3 or c2 to attack along with the h-pawn on the kingside, a strategic maneuver. Additionally, placing the bishop on the g5 square pins down black's knight. After Akimbo captured the pawn on d6, it created a blocking situation for them, restricting the movement of their light square bishop. Their bishops and knight ended up stuck behind this pawn structure, allowing me to advance my h-pawn to attack on their kingside. So he decided to initiate this plan by first playing bishop to g5. Bishop to g5 sets up a trap to pin down these knights and creates a potential opportunity to place the knight on the f5 outpost, weakening black's position. Additionally, with the move queen to d2, I can maneuver my queen to the kingside in the future, a strategic move. After black played knight to g6, they seemed to focus on the e5 square. And some of you may think that this knight is pinned by the bishop, so let me execute an attack by playing knight to d5, attacking the knight directly. However, Black can execute a brilliant strategy by sacrificing the bishop with bishop takes f2, followed by knight takes e4 check, and then capturing the bishop on g5. This knight is well protected by the queen. And let me share a quote to inspire you internally. Always show gratitude for how far you have come, for those lessons are taking you to where you are going. Going back to the position, we've observed that knight to d5 is not a good move. White then played h4 to overprotect the bishop, preparing for an attack with knight to d5. Black responded with h6 to push the bishop out from the king side. However, this move weakens the king side. By advancing the pawn, my bishop can potentially reach the b3 square to pin the f7 pawn, where my queen can potentially invade and attack on g6 square in some variations, because I can see millions of variations in a single time, because my one brain cell is better than your whole brain. Furthermore, this also prepares for the f5 outpost with knight to d4, creating vulnerability in your kingside structure. Additionally, the pinned knight can be captured, allowing queen to g4 to attack the kingside. White then pushed the pawn to h5 to target the knight. Some may consider capturing the bishop, but in that variation, after capturing back the knight, the h-file opens up, and your g-pawns will be triple, which is a Dumbo structure. Allowing bishop to b3 check, leading to a strong position for white. Regardless of black's move, e5 will face knight takes d5, leading to a favorable position for white. If black plays rook to f7, it will face knight takes g5, resulting in a favorable outcome for white. Let's return to the position. So, Akimbo didn't capture the bishop. He simply moved his knight to e5 to attack my f3 knight. At this point, after white moves their bishop back to h4, trying to maintain the pin on the knight, you can see that their entire position, along with the structure, is completely paralyzed and blocked. This is because white sacrificed their pawn on d6 a long time ago, completely freezing black's position. At this point, in my opinion, the best move would have been to play bishop to a5, advancing the pawn and then developing the bishop on the b7 square, followed by placing the rook on a good outpost to control c5. However, he decided to play bishop to c5, which is a completely ineffective move. This bishop c5 move only protects the d6 pawn from capture. He made this move to develop on his king side and potentially attack the f2 pawn with his g4 knight. However, you can see that the f2 pawn is well protected by the bishop. After I moved my bishop to b3 to maintain pressure along this diagonal and he played pawn to b5 to develop his bishop, I established dominance by playing knight to d5. The f6 knight is now completely pinned. In order to unpin the knight, he first gave me a check on a5 square. After the king moves, some may argue to capture the e4 pawn since it's unprotected, but that move would interfere with my plan to move the queen to c2 and launch a heavy attack along this diagonal, after you move back your knight to f6. I mean, regardless of where your knight goes, every square is vulnerable. For example, if the knight moves back to f6, I can easily capture it, leading to further captures, and eventually capturing your knight on e5. Then, I can simply move my queen to g6 to give a vulnerable check around your king, with your f7 pawn completely pinned. After your king moves, bishop f6 check would result in a checkmate situation for you, ending the game with a win for white. This vulnerability exposes your kingside position. At this point, after you capture the e4 pawn and the queen goes to c2, some may consider playing pawn to f5, but that would open up the light square bishop along this diagonal. So, I can play knight to e7 check, forcing your king to move, and then bishop d5 would attack both the knight and the rook simultaneously. After the rook moves, I can capture the pawn on f5, putting your knight under attack and closing off the diagonal in front of the king. Your king's structure becomes vulnerable, allowing me to dominate the position and paralyze your entire position. Returning to the position, instead of capturing the e4 pawn, black decided to capture the knight on d5, which is completely okay and suitable for black, as Obsidian was planning to capture your knight on f6 square, doubling up your pawns and disrupting your pawn structure. After he captured on d5, targeting the rook, white played an astonishing and brilliant move. I want you guys to pause the video here and try to figure out the move. You can tell me in the comments what you would suggest in this position and why you chose this move. At this point, if you dare to find Rook to h3, which is actually the best move, it demonstrates positional understanding of when and where to move your pieces to establish an attack. The Rook moves to h3, invading and attacking on the g-file towards the g3 square. The light-squared bishop is incredibly active. Positioned on this diagonal, another bishop can potentially move to the f6 square, creating vulnerability around the king side. Eventually, I can capture your knight on e5, bringing my queen to the g4 square, where the knight will no longer threaten my queen. This creates a queen-rook battery to launch an attack along this file, a strategic move indeed. Black then played queen to a4, attempting to exchange queens, but white rejected it with the move b3, this forced the queen to move. At this point, you can see the bishop's activity, the rook's position, and the knight ready to capture, paving the way for the queen to enter the g4 square. However, white first played b4, which was unnecessary. After black captures the pawn, he gets the opportunity to play rook to g3, initiating an attack on the king side with the bishop, rook, and other pieces joining forces. My h5 pawn plays a significant role, preventing the advance of the g-pawn and keeping your c8 bishop passive and unable to move. After the king moves to h8, I want you guys to pause the video again, and try to figure out the best move for white. The brilliant move that white made is rook takes g7, sacrificing the rook. If you capture the rook, I will capture your knight on e5. After you capture, I can follow up with my queen on g4 for a check, forcing the king to retreat. Then, queen f5 check will lead to checkmate by the bishop and queen on g6 square. It's a superb and brilliant move. Returning to the position, we anticipate knight takes e5, queen g4, and the highly activated light square bishop, which influenced the next move. At this point, black decided to play f5 to protect the square from the queen entering on g4. However, this move creates a positional weakness for black. After I move my rook to g6 to capture the pawn on h6, some may argue to capture the pawn on e4. But here, I can make a significant and efficient move by moving the queen to c1, directly challenging the h6 square for a potential checkmate. Black then blocks the threat by pushing their e3 pawn. Here comes a brilliant strategy: bishop check, followed by king up, rook check, and then king moves back to h8, after I play rook g8 check, which will be a double check, and after the king moves, I can play queen to c2, which is devastating for black's king. It will lead to checkmate in just 2 moves. You know, life is very crazy when Stockfish is Razi. So going back to the position, Akimbo, in this position, decided to capture the rook on g6, but he ignored that knight and played according to his own thinking by moving my queen to c1, directly attacking the h6 square and making the king vulnerable. He then blocked the diagonal by pushing his pawn to f4, he responded with a3, repositioning the queen to protect these dark squares. After the queen retreated to a4, you can see that these dark squares became vulnerable. He can potentially give a check on these squares to create a vulnerable situation for the black king. However, doing so immediately would block the check with the knight on e5 square. That's why I first captured the knight on g6. You can see that a queen check is imminent within these dark squares. Black responded by playing bishop to d4 to dominate over the dark squares, but then, I played an amazing move, bishop to e7, directly challenging your rook. Your rook cannot move because I can easily capture your f4 pawn, followed by the h6 pawn, putting the king in a difficult situation. That's why black played bishop to b7 first, in order to deflect the light square bishops. And let me tell you a life quote in sudden. Loyalty is what makes us trust, trust is what makes us stay, staying is what makes us love, and love is what gives us hope. After the captures in the game, I obtained the 6th rank pawn, which is just 2 moves away from promoting. Queen takes f4 is coming, with the threat of queen takes h6, making the king completely vulnerable. Black played rook to a8 first, and he responded with rook to b1 to prepare rook b4, attacking the queen and the bishop simultaneously. Black then blocked it with a5, after bishop takes d6 to attack these pawns, and after the bishop moves back and bishop takes f4 happens in the game, he plays king to g7. After a few moves, you can see that my queen is threatening to come to the g5 square, where the king can be vulnerable. Then, my queen moves to c5 with the idea of potentially reaching the d6 square. He immediately gives me a check with queen to c4, forcing a queen exchange, and you can see that he ends up with 3 pieces, which is completely winning for white. After a few moves later, he give him a check, push my pawns and bishop forward, forcing the king to retreat. Then, after a few more moves, he captured his rook and knight, pushing his pawns to the g-file and promote them into 2 queens in the game. Finally, in a sudden move, he give him a checkmate. What an amazing, good-looking, and astonishing game it was. In the game summary, we can say that it all started after he strategically pushed his pawn forward to d6. This d6 pawn has a strategic maneuver and method to freeze and paralyze the complete black territory and army. It freezes and paralyzes all positions for black. After a couple of moves later, he even played rook to h3 with the potential idea of moving the rook to the g3 square in the future. After moving his rook to the g3 square, he made a heavy attack along this file. He even sacrificed his rook on g7 completely. What a rook sacrifice! This rook sacrifice exposed the black king completely, which was actually accomplished in the game. After a couple of moves later, by exposing his black king on the king side, it created a checkmating position for black. What a game! I hope you enjoyed my content. Is it so? Then don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. Wish you all the best. Bye bye, see ya.